Hi, this is Tamara. 3 years ago, I was sitting in the basement of my home, waiting to present my research examining the impact of the media on trauma survivors to a national audience of journalists over Zoom, when I first heard the term moral injury. It was spoken by Sunnybrook Hospital's Dr. Anthony Feinstein, who was speaking on a panel about the impact of reporting on trauma for journalists. By this point, I was familiar with terms like PTSD and vicarious trauma, but hearing the term moral injury, which I will let Dr. Feinstein elaborate on in this episode, was something new and instantly transformational. Suddenly, I had a name for the chipping away of my soul that I had experienced so many times throughout my career, and that I continued to experience when I felt I couldn't support trauma survivors the way I felt they needed to be supported. Dr. Feinstein is a world-renowned trauma researcher who has done groundbreaking work with war correspondents, work that inspired his most recent book, Moral Courage, 19 Profiles of Investigative Journalists. All proceeds from the sale of this book go toward covering the cost of therapy for freelance journalists. I'll link to it in the show notes. All right, here's our conversation. Okay, so doctor, can you just please start out by introducing yourself?
Yes, so my name is Anthony Feinstein. I am a professor of psychiatry at the University of Toronto. I run a clinical practice and a research unit at Sunnybrook Health Sciences Centre in Toronto.
Wonderful. So Dr. Feinstein, as I've mentioned to you in the past, I was first introduced to the term moral injury when I heard you speak about it about 3 years ago. What is moral injury?
So there are a number of definitions. The one I like is as follows. It's a condition that can arise from witnessing, perpetrating, or failing to prevent acts that transgress your moral compass. And notable in that definition are two things. One of acts of commission, things that you might do or other people do. So I failed, I witnessed something or I perpetrated something, but there are also acts of omission, things that you failed to do. I should have spoken up, I should have done something, but I didn't. And so you can see moral injury coming from two main directions, things that people do, but things that you fail to do.
Right. Okay, so I want to discuss moral injury as it pertains to daily news journalists who are not working in conflict zones or under oppressive regimes, because as I mentioned, the term so deeply resonated with me as that feeling that I would get while working as a crime reporter in Toronto every time I had to reach out to someone who had just experienced a traumatic loss. And then, when I was knocking on their door, when I was calling through the phone books, when I was reaching out on, Facebook or whatever platform. And then again, as I was conducting my own research into the impact of the media on trauma survivors over the last few years, and I was confronted by all the ways that I got things wrong as a crime reporter when I thought that my very good intentions were good enough. So am I correct, Dr. Feinstein, in identifying that pit in my stomach as I knocked on those doors and the at times feelings of like crushing guilt and shame that I felt as moral injury?
Well, it depends on the circumstances of what's taking place. I mean, certainly shame and guilt are cardinal symptoms of moral injury, but I would need to know more about what you were doing at the time that evoked these feelings. If in the moment you had a sense somehow that you were compromising some moral belief that you had, or you felt that you'd crossed a threshold in terms of moral behavior, then in theory, yes, you're triggering moral injury. But it's very much context dependent.
Right. Okay. So let me expand on that a little bit. A typical example would be, there's a homicide in Toronto, say a young man is shot to death. I get the address for his next of kin from wherever, not from somebody who is saying the family wants to talk to you, here, go find them. I go knock on their door and just feeling, crossing that threshold is very difficult for me, and knocking on that door. And I've heard similar sentiments from many journalists that it's the worst part of the job. And then maybe they tell me, no, we don't want to talk. We don't want to talk. So I go away, but maybe my office says, just stay there in case they decide to talk. So I'm basically told to stay on the street
and camp outside their door. And then if I see somebody else going and knocking on their door, I'm kind of rushing up there with my voice recorder or with my microphone, hoping. And even though I know they don't want to talk, I'm still just trying to, what I've come to see as, like, take that. I just need something for my story. And for me, and I feel it right now, like just thinking about this right now makes my heart race a little bit. Is that helpful for the context for you?
It is, because what this brief anecdote illustrates is that you are on the scene, you are the person, at the very front lines of having to do this, and you're at odds with your editor who's not there. And you've got on the one hand a bereaved family telling you something, and of course you've got to respect their wishes. And the other hand, you've got a newspaper that wants news, and they're pushing you against what the family wants. So absolutely, you find yourself in a moral conundrum. And those kind of situations can certainly trigger moral injury, absolutely. They played out in many different variations over multiple different kinds of scenes that I've worked with journalists over the years.
Yeah. I've heard you speak before about how misplaced guilt can play into moral injury. But one of the things that I advocate for through trauma-informed journalism is telling these stories in a different way entirely. So not knocking on those doors, instead going through a liaison to speak with, to request an interview with that trauma survivor. Would you consider the guilt that comes from those door knocks to be misplaced? And I guess there's sort of a line between if you realize it's causing harm or you don't realize it's causing harm. But what are your thoughts on that?
I think in those situations, it's probably not misplaced. I mean, you really have to respect the family's wishes at a time like this. I mean, they're going through something which is the worst possible situation a family can go in. Someone's died, you've lost someone unexpectedly in a violent way.
Mm-hmm.
You haven't processed it yet. You are completely overwhelmed by the magnitude of what has befallen your family. And I think it's absolutely essential that at a time like that, the family's wishes have to be respected. That's paramount. So the guilt that you feel in the moment, I think, is understandable and not misplaced. The kind of misplaced guilt, I can give you many examples of that if you want, but
Yeah.
I don't think that's one of those. So for me, the history that I've heard multiple times comes from frontline photographers, for example, who feel that they arrive at the scene of a massacre or disaster, and they're pushing their lenses into the faces of bereaved people and people who've lost a lot of things. And I understand where that emotion comes from, but at the same time, people often want their stories told. It's not that everybody doesn't want their stories told. Secondly, it's the journalist's job to tell that story. And they have to do it well because they need to inform us of what's going on. So the journalist does that, and then what do? They end up getting an award for their work.
Yeah.
And they feel bad that they got the award because they feel that this award is on the backs of other people suffering, and they feel guilty about that. And for me, that's misplaced guilt. My answer to them is, you have done your job really well as a journalist. For your peers to recognize that and to celebrate that is basically a plus for you, because it's testimony to how effectively you've done your work. To feel guilty about your profession is misplaced guilt. Yes, there can be things in your profession that make you feel guilty, but this is not one of them. You are being celebrated because of your skill, because of your ability to take a great photograph and enjoy the moment. It doesn't mean that you don't feel empathy for the people who you photo. Of course you do. That you don't have deep sympathy for what they're going through. Absolutely you do. And I think the great photographers often display their empathy through their photographs. These photographs can be very moving testimonies to what they've witnessed. And so I think you've really got to recalibrate the way people think about these things. Your job was to take the photograph. You did it very well. You've given voice to people who don't have a voice. You've highlighted a story. You've demonstrated, your skills. You've educated the public on so many levels. You've done something that's really tremendous. And the fact that you're being rewarded for it is a plus. Don't see it as somehow I am, profiting on the suffering of other people. That's not the way to do.
So a couple things come to mind when I hear you share that story. First of all, very relatable, very relatable. It brings to mind for me, I had been, I think I might have talked about this on this podcast before, so I apologize to listeners if you're listening to this story again. But I was nominated for what I was told was a very prestigious award when I was working as a crime reporter in Toronto. And it was basically a best local reporter award. And, I remember a colleague sending me an email when I was on mat leave saying, this is a big deal. And I thought, wow, best local reporter, they're judging me on my body of work. Like that's awesome. And I actually felt proud of it because I had felt guilt in the past about some of the awards I had received based on stories about other people's, very traumatic events. And only once I got to the award ceremony did one of my bosses turn to me and say, so you know what story this is for, right? What? No, I have no idea. Nobody told me I was being nominated, anything like that. And he told me, and it was an awful story, which, I was celebrated for. Obviously, people thought I told it very well. It was a horrible tragedy that had happened in the GTA. I'm not going to get into the details right now. And it was one where I had gone to ask a woman if she would like to speak with me. She said no. I had gone back to start filing my story, talk to other people, got a call from one of my bosses and said, can you go try again? Because she just talked to the Toronto Sun. And I had to go back and ask again. And then she said yes. And I talked to her, and I always carried that guilt with me, I guess. So hearing that I was nominated, this is why I was nominated for that award, suddenly it's like I didn't want it. But then it also brings something else to mind for me, Dr. Feinstein, because you said at the beginning of that, some people, these people by and large want their stories told. Some people don't, but some people do. I guess the conundrum for journalists, and I've heard this from photojournalists too, is when you don't know if they want their story told. So one example being, let's say there's a homicide. I'm speaking about Toronto a lot because that's where I spent the bulk of my career. I'm thinking about one photo in particular where there was a young man shot to death and his mother arrives on scene just as she's heard the news and is collapsing at the police jeep and just anguish on her face, right? And the photographer captures that moment and it ends up on the front page of a major Canadian newspaper. And then, but how do we know in that moment? How does that photographer know? Because I've heard from many trauma survivors after the fact that they don't want that image to exist of them. But when you're a daily news reporter, it's not reasonable to think that he's going to go up to her, or is it? To think he's going to go up to her and say, do I have permission to use your photograph? When she's carted off right away to investigators, all that stuff. So there's sort of a guilt that can come there. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, look, my perspective is going to be different from the editor's, of course, but
it's such a valuable perspective. So that's why I want to talk to you.
So in my profession in medicine, the cardinal rule is doctor do no harm. And I think you have to bring that same lens to what you do as well in the moment, because in that particular moment, you are getting that person at their most vulnerable, at a moment of overwhelming trauma. And when in doubt, and there's going to be doubt, when in doubt, be conservative. I think, reflect potentially the wishes of the person who in the moment is in no condition to give you permission. That would be my view on things. And I recognize that you can miss a moment, you can miss a great photograph, you can miss the high drama of what's going on. I understand that. But behind all of that is a person.
Yes.
And that person has to live with the consequences of what's taken place for the rest of their life. And a photograph can become a constant reminder of it. And the classic example of that, which was in a very public forum, was the Oklahoma City bombing, Timothy McVeigh. And there was this iconic photograph of a firefighter coming out of the ruins of the building with a bloody baby.
Yes.
And a man took a photograph. He wasn't a photographer. I've written about him. I wrote an essay on him. He was a banker. He was a banker sitting in one of the Oklahoma City banks alongside the courthouse that went up. And he heard this tremendous bang. And this man was a wannabe photographer. He always kept a camera with him. And so he ran downstairs, and he was the first man on the scene of this terrible tragedy. And he took this photograph, and the photograph ended up winning a Pulitzer Prize. And the photograph was on so many front pages around the world. But that baby belonged to a parent.
Mm-hmm.
And that was her child. And she was deeply upset about having this photograph displayed. And there was this, a very public disagreement between the mother on the one hand and the paper that published it on the other, and the photograph got sucked in, etc. Well, and so that you've got this debate. There's this remarkable photograph that captured, I think, in the most visceral way, the horrors of the moment, which is what a great photograph can do. But there's a person involved, and their parents involved, and their trauma was terrible. They'd lost a child, and now it's displayed on the front page of all these papers without their consent.
So where do you land on that, Dr. Feinstein?
I always respect the feelings of the people involved. Mm-hmm. I'm not a journalist. For me, it's a very clear-cut issue that I'm a person who tries to take away the pain of others through my work, through my therapy, my interventions. And so for me, that's the most important thing over here. And if you can lessen that to a degree, mm-hmm. that's really important. You can't take away that woman's pain because she's just lost a baby, but you can stop magnifying it because that photograph is there as a public record for everyone to see. If you go down to Oklahoma City, you go to this incredible museum that they built, Museum of the Bombing, there's this photograph. Every time this woman sees the photograph, it reminds her of what happened. And so it becomes a constant reminder of a trauma that's very hard to move beyond. And I think, from a trauma perspective, that's a very difficult situation to deal with. So if you can prevent that, if you can lessen that, for me, that becomes a priority over here, not the Pulitzer photograph.
We'll be right back.
So that's really interesting for me to hear you say that. I wasn't sure what you would have to say about these sorts of issues because many of the journalists that you've worked with over the years in conflict zones and under these oppressive regimes, they would be capturing photos where, things are happening quickly and you can't, like in that case with Oklahoma, for example, should they not have run that photo to begin with? Should they have been thinking about, this is somebody's child, this could cause them harm, we should figure out who this baby is, who they belong to first? Or is it a matter of, when they know the parents are upset about it, putting a do not run item in their archive, not repeating it? Because if that would have happened today, it wouldn't have just been in print. Like Oklahoma City bombing happened before the proliferation of social mm-hmm. media and all that. If it would have happened today, it would have been, you can't bring that back. It's everywhere immediately.
Well, as you know, many people who've been through traumatic events do want their story told. They are, in the moment, not comfortable, but accepting of having their photograph taken because they want it to be out there. They want there to be a record of it. They want people to know what's gone down. So if you've got permission, there's no debate. I think when you don't have permission, then you're in very difficult territory, as Oklahoma City story makes very clear.
So what role do you think newsroom management should play in this, in ensuring that responsible journalism? Because I really see it as, I often tell journalists, you cannot adequately take care of yourself unless you take care of the people, unless you take care of the people you're reporting on. And I wonder what role you think newsroom management should play with this, especially in a day where they're starting to talk more about well-being and, journalism, mm-hmm. wellness, and rightfully so. But given that the directive often comes from management, get the photo, or a pat on the back if you do get something that nobody else got. How should they be looking at this?
Well, there needs to be a discussion about it, of course. What's interesting is that when we developed the Toronto Moral Injury Scale for journalists, it's a very simple scale. There are 9 questions. There's a whole subsection which relates to how journalists feel at odds with the editors on this. So they felt that the editor made the wrong call or the paper made the wrong call from a moral perspective. So there's clearly a difference in opinion between the journalist who's on the ground doing something and the editor who is not on the ground, who's removed from the situation, who's making a call that they feel is in the best interest of the newspaper. And this becomes a source of moral conflict between the journalist and the editor. And it's surfaced repeatedly in our fieldwork. And that's why it's very much part of the Toronto Moral Injury Scale, which is I felt my newspaper or my editor made decisions that were not morally comfortable to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think to try and bridge this gap, to minimize that, there needs to be a discussion between the editors and the journalists in advance. How are we going to approach a story like this? How are we going to manage these kind of situations, which, you know, are going to crop up all the time? And if there is a discussion and a policy, as much as it can be in advance, and people are on the same page and discuss the ramifications of this decision and that decision, we're going to come up with a maybe a compromise that satisfies everyone. Then the individuals are going to be much less likely to develop moral injury because they know that when I'm out there, I'm doing something that we've spoken about in advance. We've agreed on this. This is what we decided to do. It's always going to be a difficult thing to do. It's always going to be a very hard story to cover. But at least everybody's speaking with the same voice. They're on the same page. We've got a similar approach to how we should manage this. When you go into a complex, difficult situation like that, but the newsroom is fractured, you've got editors saying one thing, journalists saying something else, then that becomes a much more difficult situation to marry and fertile ground for moral injury.
Yes. Oh my gosh, that resonates with me a lot. And certainly I think will resonate with so many journalists as you would expect as well, given your field work. Okay, so you just mentioned this Toronto Moral Injury Scale for journalists. Can you just tell me a little bit more about that? And I want to hear what the uptake or response has been from newsrooms to this.
Okay, so it came from research that we did about 6 years back. A colleague of mine, Hannah Storm, a journalist at the time who was with the International News Safety Institute, approached me to ask whether she could partner with me on a study looking at journalists covering the migration crisis in Europe, because there was this huge wave of migrants, millions of migrants coming out of Africa and the Middle East, making their way through Europe. And news organizations were battling with the story, and they wanted to know how was this affecting the health of the journalists. And I think 8 or 9 news organizations bought into the study, and we did this research project. And we didn't show high rates of PTSD in the journalists. There weren't higher rates of depression. There was no significant substance abuse, which is all good news. But what we found was something called moral injury, which at the time was very new to journalists, but certainly not new to mental health specialists. Moral injury as a concept has been around for a long time. The military were very familiar with it. They had big challenges with moral injury in their young soldiers coming back from the war in Iraq, for example. So the military had to get to grips with moral injury. They will go back to Vietnam. But journalists essentially hadn't addressed moral injury at all. And so when we studied this large group of journalists covering the migrant crisis, I remember thinking to myself, we have to look at moral injury. And we have to tease out moral injury amongst all the things that we were looking at. And then we faced a big challenge because there was no self-report rating scale for moral injury in journalists. The military had 2 or 3 at the time. So we borrowed one from the military, but you can't apply military principles to journalists. I mean, they're so fundamentally different. So we had to take the military scale and cut out a whole lot of stuff because it was just not applicable. So we had a very watered down scale that still captured some of the core features of what moral injury is. And our data showed that moral injury was indeed a big issue in these journalists. And so that in itself was interesting. We wrote about it. We published it in a number of places. And then it became clear to me that if you wanted to assess moral injury in journalists, you have to have your own tools to do it. And so around this time, a student wrote to me from Germany saying he'd like to come work in my lab and pursue a PhD. And I said, well, we've got a great project for you to pursue. You're going to come across and develop the first rating scale for moral injury in journalists.
Wow.
And so we came across and we did it. And we got a lot of support from Canadian media for that. In fact, the Globe and Mail and David Wormsley were very helpful with this. Opened many doors. And the end product is the scale that is out there for for news organizations to use. A number of them have started to use it. This week, the American Press Institute ran a big article on moral injury and highlighted the scale and basically published the scale in this article for to put it out there in the public domain for news organizations to use. And I think it's a very useful, simple tool for news organizations to bring into the newsroom just to get a flavor of what is the moral temperature like with our journalists and our management.
Mm.
And
You wrote, sorry, go ahead.
And I think it starts a very important discussion.
Yes. You wrote in a Globe and Mail column in 2022, talking about this scale. With an eye on history, we should not miss today's opportunity to help those affected by moral injury. So how would you say, you said that you put this out there for newsrooms to use. You mentioned the Globe and Mail being very helpful. In general, how would you say newsrooms are doing? There are certainly newsrooms who are beginning to address this, but I think many daily news journalists I know would say their bosses aren't addressing it at all. They're still telling them to do things that contradict their moral compass.
Yeah. So my reference to an eye on history goes back to when I started to do my research, which was 1999. And the remarkable thing about that time was there wasn't a single publication written on journalists, conflict, and trauma, not one. I remember doing a literature search and not believing it because there was a huge trauma literature. Victims of assault and rape and soldiers and veterans and police, but nothing on journalists. I didn't believe it. I remember, going down from Sunnybrook to the Robarts Library at the U of T and speaking to librarians saying, what are we missing over here? And they said, give us 24 hours, we'll come back to you. And they came back, you're not missing anything. There's nothing written on this topic, not a single thing.
Wow.
And so, 1999, it was pre-9/11, but there were still lots of bad things going on in the world. I mean, the Balkan civil wars were coming to an end. Afghanistan was perpetually in conflict. There was a lot of trauma around. There had been a genocide in Rwanda, etc., and journalists had to cover all of that. But nothing was being done to address the potential mental health consequences for journalists covering these stories. And so when I say an eye on history, I was looking back at the time, and news organizations were not fulfilling a very important aspect of they'd abrogated a duty, which you've got to look after journalists. If you expect journalists to go to the world's most dangerous places to cover the most difficult stories, you've got to look after them. It's not enough just to give them a flak jacket or say, here's your helmet. You've got to look after their mental well-being. So that's the background to my reference to history. And I think with moral injury, there was a similar thing, that you've now got this issue that's been around in journalism for a long time, but you're not doing anything about it. It's a little bit like, the PTSD story going back 20 years back. You were doing nothing about PTSD then. When you're doing it now, it should be the same with moral injury. Because in my opinion, moral injury is much more prevalent than PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
Now, moral injury is not a mental illness, thankfully. But it's still something that causes considerable distress, as you know.
Mm-hmm.
And it can become the conduit to PTSD and depression. So you can't ignore it. And that's why I made this point, don't repeat the errors of the past.
I've heard you speak on the journalism.co.uk podcast about the consequences of ignoring moral injury. And, you said that you can become cynical, start to doubt yourself, your profession, why am I doing this? Am I making a difference? You get a sense of alienation, view your profession in a negative light because you're feeling ashamed by things. And you said, you don't want angry, cynical individuals reporting on the news, telling you what's going on, because undoubtedly there would be a bias on what they're reporting, that they'd see the world with a different set of eyes compared to someone who is well. But as I listen to you say those words, cynical, seeing your profession in a negative light, ashamed, for me, that described so many journalists that I've worked with in the past and present. And it described me, like us journalists sort of joke about being professional cynics. Oh, we're cynical by nature because we're journalists. Like, how problematic is that?
Well, I think it depends, how deep the cynicism is and where does it come from. My comments were very much limited to the potential fallout from moral injury, which is very well described. First of all, it's very difficult to walk around carrying guilt and shame and disgust and anger, which are the features, cardinal emotions of moral injury. These are not comfortable emotions to be with all the time. So that's a negative as a starter. And then you have the behavioral consequences. That's the emotional consequences, but the behavioral consequences are, well, you do become cynical. You lose empathy for yourself and for others, even for family members and friends. Your friendship starts suffering. You start doubting yourself. Why am I doing this? You start viewing your profession in a negative light. And those, of course, are awful things to have to characterize your career and your personal life with. So the ramifications of moral injury can be considerable. I think that's my that was my pitch in the moment. Do you become somewhat hard-boiled as a journalist because you're covering difficult stories? I think that's inevitable because it's going to be a bit of a protective shell that you have to put around yourself for to survive. But you have to ensure that doesn't destroy your empathy or your connection to your subject or the meaning that you take from your work or the factors that motivate you. Why am I doing this? Because if you start losing that, then I think you will end up, first of all, you'll end up in a very uncomfortable place for yourself, but your journalism is not going to be what it should.
Dr. Feinstein, as I mentioned in the introduction to this episode, you've authored many, many books, but your most recent is Moral Courage, 19 Profiles of Investigative Journalists. What is moral courage?
Right. So moral courage for me, which is a theory that I expound in the book, is that it becomes, in a way, the antidote to moral injury. And when you read what researchers say about moral injury, there's a very good book by a man called Rushworth Kidder, and he feels that you have to have 3 cardinal ingredients for moral courage to be present. Number one, you've got to have the situation, which is a dangerous one, or one in which you can be compromised in some way. So the situation has to be an uncomfortable one, a difficult one, a dangerous one. Number 2, you've got to have your own moral compass, which has to be calibrated to a certain level. And then number 3, you've got to have your own agency. In other words, you're prepared to act and do something in relation to what you're feeling. So when those 3 ingredients, as it were, combine at the center of your Venn diagram, if all 3 variables are present, you have moral courage. If you've got the danger and you're prepared to do something, but you don't have that moral compass driving you, well, then you're physically courageous, but the moral component is missing. If you've got the moral compass, which is there, and you've got the dangerous situation, but you don't do anything, you're timid. You're missing that one particular ingredient. So you have to have the 3 variables coalesce to have moral courage, which I think for me makes perfect sense. I think it's a very nice way of viewing what moral courage is. And so using that as a guide to, this is moral courage, I then applied it to journalists working in countries that have a dreadful record of press freedom. Russia, Belarus, Azerbaijan, places like that, Iran, Syria, to try and answer the question, why is it that there are journalists who will stand up in situations like this and call out their regime, even though they know that the consequences for them personally can be terrible. Russia's a classic example. You stand up and you criticize Putin. In the past, you would have very hard time, end up in jail and potentially dead. So what makes a journalist still take on a regime like that? And my attempt at answering it is, okay, motivation is complex. You can't boil it down to one factor. There are going to be many things that motivate people to behave a certain way. But a core feature for these journalists is a sense of moral hurt, that they're looking at something in the society which is so egregious that they just can't accept it. By staying silent, it becomes an act of omission. An act of omission can be one of the triggers for moral injury. Remember, we spoke about moral injury can arise from acts of commission, things that you do or other people do, but also from things that you don't do, acts of omission. So staying quiet is an act of omission. And to a man and woman, these journalists said to me, keeping quiet for them was just unacceptable because it came with such feelings of shame in guilt and a sense of personal betrayal, for them that was the worst possible outcome. Even worse than what Vladimir Putin might throw at them, or what the leader of Belarus would throw at a journalist. They could not keep quiet. And that's a remarkable observation, because we all have a moral compass, but we also have a sense of self-preservation. And when you get into the territory in which speaking out is going to come with really egregious personal consequences, the majority of people don't speak out. You say, hold on a second, I know things are bad, I know things are terrible, but if I'm going to speak about it publicly, they're going to hammer me, they're going to hit my family, I can't do it. And so you feel bad about it, but you don't say anything. The select small group of journalists aren't prepared to do that. And so the focus is on them. And their stories are very powerful and profoundly moving, because these are individuals living in countries in which they now represent the very last vestiges of civil society. The rest is gone. Think of Russia. The courts are a joke. The judges are in the pocket of Putin and his cronies. There's no democracy left. The NGOs have been chased out the country. There's nothing left. All the kinds of things that nourish a free society have been destroyed, except these few individuals whom a powerful government can't destroy because they're not prepared to keep quiet. So that in itself is very moving and very remarkable. But it's more than that. We in the West feel complacent. We are complacent about things like press freedom and our human rights. We take them for granted because we grew up with them. We live in very comfortable societies. But they are under threat. Look at the United States now. Look at the democratic process in the United States. Look what Donald Trump represents. And so, where does Donald Trump get his playbook from? He learns from people like Orban in Hungary, or Erdogan in Turkey, people who are autocratic rulers who don't want the opposition, who want to basically bend the media or break the media to their will. That's his playbook. He can learn from it, and he is learning from it. We know that. He openly admires people like that. And those things have seeped into the body politic in the United States and into journalism, to the consternation of so many people. So what's taking place in countries like Russia and Turkey, India, Belarus, are not events far away from us that we can look at and say, oh boy, that's terrible, but at least we're okay over here. No, in this global economy, and we're all interconnected, those malign influences are taking root in Western democracies to our peril. And so we can learn from that.
I wanted to ask you about that, because this podcast is generally more focused on daily news coverage of local events, not in war zones, not under these oppressive regimes. But I do think that one of the most stressful parts of being a journalist anywhere in any Western country, Canada, United States, you name it, is the disdain that a growing number of people have for so-called mainstream media, a disdain that has been sparked and fueled in large part by politicians like Donald Trump. So with that said, you just mentioned that Donald Trump, he's taking lessons from the playbook of these dictatorial regimes. What lessons can the West learn from these journalists with moral courage, from the countries where the journalists you profiled have worked in?
Yeah, we have to listen very carefully to what they say, because the lessons there for us. As Stefan Docenovic said to me, he's a Serbian journalist. He said to me, what's going down in Serbia, the way the government's running for the media. He says that's something that is taking place in the West now. He says, look at our country and see what can go wrong, because it's starting to happen where you live as well. This is not something that you're isolated from. It's contagious, basically, and so it's a very clear warning to our societies that you've got to be perpetually vigilant about your democracy, about your freedom of speech, your freedom of expression, because it's under threat in a very significant way. And in Canada, we're clearly not immune to this either. Look at those protests about vaccines, etc. And the way a capital city was brought almost to a standstill by people who just buy into conspiracy theories and don't trust what the media says and doubt everything. So
Journalists were spat upon, screamed at. I know journalists in Toronto who, one woman told me that somebody threatened to come and kill her children, tried to drive her off the road. Like, serious stuff happened. And I completely agree. Like, when I look at what's happening in the United States, I see, especially during, the pandemic, the same thing happening here in that dangerous anti-media, anti-quote unquote mainstream media rhetoric. And I do think that, that and social media and misinformation, everything is for me the scariest thing facing this planet right now. So I'm really happy that you mentioned that. And because when I think about terms like moral courage, I think, well, journalists in the West, can they really even have moral courage? Because they don't have that prerequisite of a dangerous environment. So, okay.
You do now, you see, because this is what has come to the United States. I mean, I had to work with journalists after January 6th. That was a very dangerous situation. There were journalists who were trapped in the Capitol who feared for their lives. I mean, this was a mob. This was an insurrection. And so, unbelievable as it is to contemplate it, the barbarians are at the gate, as it were. I mean, this message has taken root within our society over here. And you've just spoken about, some of the threats that local journalists had to deal with at the time of the, the vaccine protests, etc. I mean, these are journalists doing local news now who are confronting these issues. So, I make reference to war zones and dictatorial regimes far away, but this has seeped into local, domestic journalism, aspects of it. It's not something that's separate anymore. It's very much part of it. And another example of where it's happening in a very significant way is with climate change journalism, where you've got these journalists covering what I think is the biggest existential threat that we face, which is climate change. And you've got the climate deniers who attack them in a very militant way. These are journalists doing really difficult stories, moving from one community to another. These communities have been destroyed. People have lost family members, loved ones. Their homes have been destroyed. Their livelihoods are gone. So they're covering very difficult stories, and they're getting hammered for it by a significant segment of the population who don't believe them, who claim that they're spreading lies, etc. And that's been stoked by unscrupulous politicians. So it's all linked.
Yes.
And that's a great sense of moral hurt as well, because you've got these journalists saying, we can't shift the needle on this. We think this is such a huge crisis that we all face as a planet. And, our work is being vilified. We're not making a difference. The more we try and demonstrate to fellow citizens that this is a major, major problem, we're getting hammered for it. And that becomes a source of real moral pain.
We'll be right back.
In a different way, journalists don't necessarily get hammered from the public for stories that they do about drunk driving or gun violence or anything like that. But you just saying that just reminded me of what, so many journalists say about, reporting on those very common daily issues where they feel like they keep reporting on the same stories over and over again. There's another child killed by a drunk driver. There's another person, killed by gun violence. And they feel like they need to shout from the rooftops, like, pay attention. This is happening. Or something I've heard from journalists in the United States with all the mass shootings down there, incidents of mass violence. Like, it just keeps happening and they feel like nothing is changing. And I guess that can really be a sense of, or a source of moral injury, right? Where it's not necessarily people are saying, don't cover these stories, you're lying. Although sometimes that does happen with mass violence in the US. But it's just that it just keeps happening. And so it's like, why are we doing this work if it's not making a difference?
And that's a really good point, because that question crops up all the time. And the message is, you've got to keep doing the work because you need to keep a historical record of what's happening, with the hope that down the road things will change. But you've got to maintain a record of it, because if you don't, then pieces that happened at all. And so, being a contemporary historian, that's one of the messages that I give journalists. There's a very important role. You are contemporary historians. You are keeping us informed. You are keeping the record of our times. And we have to have this record. It's absolutely essential we have this record. Even if in the moment you feel things aren't shifting. This is going to be the long game. We have to believe in it. That ultimately things move in the right direction. Things do get better. It's just taking, much slower than you'd hoped. But you've got to believe that. And I think if you look at the long arc of history, Martin Luther King said that, we ultimately all move in the right direction, slowly, bit by bit. And I think that's true. You'll be impatient about it. You want it to happen a lot quicker than it's happening. But you've got to have the record of what's gone down to see how we shift.
Mm-hmm.
And so keep doing it because this work is very important.
Dr. Feinstein, if I may, I'd like to speak with you just a bit about your research into the impact of user-generated content. This is work that was published in 2017. It examined the impact of photographs and videos sent to newsrooms by viewers and readers, essentially the man on the street, raw images of graphic content. I've certainly seen my fair share of that over the years. When I was thinking about this yesterday, as I was preparing for this interview, I was thinking back to like July 2016, working when these raw images of a terror attack in France began showing up on the newsroom wires. And of course, the public would never see those images. And if they did, they would have been heavily censored. But someone needs to see those images before they're censored. A video editor, a reporter, a manager, any number of people in a newsroom. Can you just tell me briefly, like, what your research found was the impact of this content on journalists?
Yeah, so I was approached by two news organizations at the time, one British and one American, who were concerned about some of their journalists who had been tasked with screening this material. And so there were journalists whose basically entire job was to sit in a darkened room from dawn to dusk, basically, looking at images coming in from all over the world that had a terrible visual content. And management were concerned what kind of effect did this have on these journalists. So the only way to answer a question is to try and do a good research project. So we did one, and we showed, once again, no surprise, that there are going to be some journalists who find this very difficult. The rates of distress that you see in journalists who do this are not as high as journalists who are out in the field, covering war zones, for example, because what's missing when you're in a newsroom is the element of personal danger. You're not going to get killed looking at a TV screen. So that's a huge variable in terms of trauma, but still, it can be very difficult work to do. And, you might not know this, but in, I think it was 2013, the American Psychiatric Association tweaked their diagnostic criteria for PTSD by revisiting the whole stressor criterion. So the stressor for PTSD is you have to witness an event that was very dangerous to you, that could have killed you, or was dangerous to other people and did indeed kill other people. So the stressor criterion is very high for PTSD. Mm-hmm. But in 2013, they tweaked that to say, if in your line of work, you're exposed to visually traumatic images, this is now considered a sufficiently severe stressor to trigger PTSD, and that's absolutely germane to journalists. And they're very clear in saying it has to be in your line of work. This is not the individual who watches the 9 o'clock news on television. No, because otherwise you're going to say, well, the whole society can be to develop PTSD. No, this was something that was specific. If in your line of work, media people, you have to deal with a lot of visually troubling images for prolonged periods, this was now considered a sufficient stress for PTSD. And so indeed, we saw that in the group that we studied, that there were some individuals who were very vulnerable to this and showed all the clinical features of post-traumatic stress disorder. And the people who are more vulnerable were those who often had a past history of trauma. And it turned out that some of the people doing this work were immigrants or refugees from countries that had a very traumatic history and that fled. And what are they doing now? They're now looking at television screens, which basically take them right back to their own country, showing the horrors that they left behind. So you can imagine how difficult that is to process emotionally. And so people like that were really quite vulnerable when it came to looking at material like this.
So it's interesting because you just said, we're not talking about the people who are watching the 9 o'clock news, but,
yes,
there's a lot that's changed since 2017 in terms of these types of graphic images and how widely available they are to members of the general public, shared on social media. Can you then extrapolate, like when I think about, just because it's a very recent and ongoing conflict in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, the Hamas's attack on Israel, there was this deluge of graphic content that was shared on social media very widely. You know, I remember my husband working behind me and saying, have you seen this stuff? And I'm telling him, stop, don't look at it. It's going to be harmful for you. I think you got to just shut down social media for now. Could you then extrapolate the findings of your user-generated content research to the impact on members of the media who are now seeing these graphic, or members of the public, I should say, who are now seeing these graphic images shared more broadly, you know, either by social media or by mainstream media?
Yeah. I think it's hazardous to extrapolate my data to the broader content, but you can go and look at studies which have investigated that. And the classic example was after 9/11.
Yes.
I was going to say
that.
which, you know, media organizations over and over again showed, you know, people jumping out of skyscrapers as horrendous images, just kind of, you know, in a loop playing.
Yes.
And so there were a number of studies investigating how did this affect, you know, the average citizen who was watching television. And in many ways, the results mirrored what we found with our user-generated study, which was that the majority of people are going to be fine. But there's going to be those vulnerable individuals who have a lot of problems with this. People with a past psychiatric history, a past history of trauma, other mental health difficulties, etc. You know, they're vulnerable when it comes to emotional stressors. And they were the individuals who, you know, started to show some significant symptoms of PTSD. It's almost like PTSD by proxy. And I remember back in 2001, 9/11.
Yes.
You know, the American Psychiatric Association hadn't yet tweaked the diagnostic criteria for PTSD. That came 12 years later with the DSM-5. So the notion that you could kind of get, you know, PTSD from watching television as an average citizen hadn't really entered our consciousness. But the data showed very clearly that there were vulnerable people who, if you're exposed to this hour and hour and hour, you know, many hours a day, that can become a very major stressor for them. And I think it's absolutely true to you know what's going on right now in the world, Ukraine, Israel, Gaza, same thing.
Yeah. And if you and I don't know if we're referring to the same study, but I know one study that I had read about the 9/11 media coverage. I believe it said that basically if you live, like the closer you lived to, you know, the place of impact, to the towers, you were at a higher risk of developing PTSD, well, you know, as you consumed this media coverage. So it's interesting because just as we now recognize that journalists are, you know, at a higher risk of developing PTSD than members of the general population, there's also a recognition that members of the population who consume this wall-to-wall coverage of traumatic events, we think about, you know, mass violence incidents or wars, conflict zones, that they can be at a higher risk as well of developing PTSD.
A little. I mean, I do believe that people are resilient, right? I think you know, the majority of people in society will never develop PTSD. When you look at, you know, the lifetime prevalence of PTSD in Canada, it's about 6%, which is actually very high for a mental illness. But you know, that's 94% of the population or more will never develop something like this. The people that you have to worry about, that my profession has to be concerned about, are the vulnerable individuals.
Yes.
People with a past history of trauma, people who come from traumatized societies. You know, there's so many immigrants coming into Canada, many of them coming from deeply traumatized societies, Afghanistan, Somalia, places like that, where you've left behind terrible trauma. And when you come to your new country and then you confront new traumas, well, you're vulnerable. Immigration itself can be hard and the stress. You still got all your baggage from your past that you haven't dealt with. And now, you know, sitting in a darkened newsroom, and your job was to, you know, be given a nice job by a big news organization. What's my job? Well, to look at the kind of traumas that we fled.
And isn't that interesting though? Because in my experience, like I do a lot of work with first responders, talking to journalists. There's a lot of people, they go into these professions because of past traumas. When you talk to them, you know, there might have been, I'm not saying most people by any means, but there are people who are drawn to these professions because they see it as a way of giving back or of helping people in a way that maybe they would have liked to be helped when they were younger, or maybe they were helped through a traumatic event. And so this is a whole other discussion we're getting into, Dr. Feinstein, but there are people that go into these professions, and I think journalism is among them because of past traumas. And so then they would be entering the profession inherently at a higher risk when they're, you know, faced with these traumatic exposures.
I mean, I'll share some data with you, which is our most recent publication, which I think is fascinating. So over the course of 24 years now, I've collected an enormous database of frontline journalists doing difficult work from many different countries. So Western journalists, Canadian Brits, but also Mexican journalists, journalists in Syria, Afghanistan, Iran. We've got a data set, Kenya, Israel, Afghanistan, so many different countries. And we pooled all the data. Now, from a research perspective, you have to be very careful. You really can't compare Canadians to Afghans, to Mexicans, to Kenyans, because there are cultural nuances to trauma. And it's like comparing apples and oranges. You just can't do it. But what you can do is that you can go to each individual study and say, okay, what are the risk factors for trauma in Kenya and in Mexico and Israel and Afghanistan? What are the protective factors? So look at each country individually. You take those risk factors and protective factors and then compare them across the society, which you can do. That's perfectly valid, which is what we did. And we found that the single biggest protective factor for journalists across all these countries, doesn't matter where you work, doesn't matter your language, etc., is a good relationship. And that fits beautifully with the broader psychiatric literature. We've known that for decades. Good relationships are good for your mental health. And there it is with journalists. If you've got good relationships, it's to a degree protective of your mental health. What are the risk factors? Past history of trauma, past history of psychiatric difficulties. Doesn't matter where you are, whether you're an Israeli, a Syrian, an Iranian, Kenyan, Mexican, Canadian, Brit, it's the same thing. If you come into this difficult work with a past history of mental health difficulties, you are more vulnerable. The other thing we found is that women are more vulnerable. And women are more vulnerable because you're more likely to be assaulted sexually than men, I think. I think that's the big variable over here. So there are universal truths with these things across all of society and cultures. Look after your relationships because they're protective. Devote time to your relationships. And individuals are not equal when it comes to vulnerability. And people who come from a traumatic background, have had to deal with past traumas, who have had to receive therapy for past traumas, are ones who are potentially more vulnerable. It doesn't mean they can't do this work, of course they can. It just means that they're more vulnerable to decompensating when you confront traumas in war zones or revolutions, or even closer to home, like riots in the capital places.
Dr. Feinstein, I would love to talk to you for hours. I find your work so fascinating and such a gift to my industry, journalism, my former industry, sometimes current. And I'm grateful to you. Is there anything else that you would like to add? Being mindful of your time, you're a very busy and sought after individual.
No, thank you. I enjoyed talking to you. Thank you for your questions.
My absolute pleasure.